All right. And it seems like we're getting ready to go on air. Sorry to cut you off so quickly. And hello and welcome. You're watching SABC News channel here on 404 The Full View, coming to you live from the Goethe Institute this evening. This is part of the Future of Journalism series that is being held by Media Monitoring Africa, as well as several project partners with them, including the German embassy. And credibility is the issue that we'll be focusing on tonight, Stephen. As you may well know, that there have been various issues raised about media credibility, and some have said it's because of where we are in our transitional democracy, various incidents that we've seen coming out of the state capture inquiry, and of course the advent of new media. Some are wondering if this is why it's apt to have this conversation, to talk about credibility. Exactly what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about that, and when we talk about measuring credibility? So we have a very able panel this evening, Stephen, that is going to talk about that. Our panelists tonight are immediately to my left. Okay. So that was a warm-up, I suppose. Thank you, Sherbet. Thank you. Yeah. Voice ready? Hello? Of journalism changing, raising questions about the credibility of the media. How do they receive that criticism? This is something that others are asking. Is it fair criticism, fair game, considering that we have more and more media outlets that are there providing information? Of course, attached to that is the freedom of expression. We've just had Media Monitoring Africa speaking earlier on, just laying down some of what some would say the springboards of what we're talking about when we're talking about credibility of the media. Let me just talk to panelists, introduce you to them. Glenda Daniels is to my immediate left. She's a Wits lecturer, and joining us, including Glenda, I'm sorry, I've got them in a particular order, so I just want to make sure that it's by the order that they're seated. So let's introduce you now to Head of Investigations and Data at Zeit Online in Germany, that's Holger Stark. And I'd also like to introduce Nikiwe Bigita. You know her, broadcast and radio journalist, currently sitting on the SANEF inquiry into media ethics panel there. We had a discussion about getting that language right, because it is important. And let me introduce you as well to another journalist, that is Varashni Pillay, journalist and editor, head of digital at Power FM. That's no longer, you've moved on, I believe, both. Okay, so, and she'll tell us about her new venture. And you know, of course, Chris Vick, Spin Doctor, a media strategist. Still an apt label, Chris? Spin Doctor. Okay, great. Just wanted to be sure. And of course, we've got a panel here that will share their views on this. We've got an audience who will ask questions about this. But perhaps the first thing I would like to ask, and I'll ask you just to all share your views, a minute each perhaps, is whether or not there's consensus that there is a crisis of credibility in South Africa, especially looking at South African media. And are we talking about the same? When we talking about credibility in the media and journalism, and I know, Glenda, that's quite an academic point that you probably also want to jump in on.
Well, yes and no, because I say this because there is a sector of journalism in this country that's doing a hell of a good job. In fact, if it wasn't for this very credible sector in journalism, we wouldn't have had the Gupta leaks, which now the NPA say it's using as evidence to bring the crooks home, bring the money back into the country. So yes, even those that good part of journalism would agree there's a credibility in journalism. But to make an academic point that I'd like to make, it would be that I am inscribed, my view is inscribed in my gaze, which means all journalists have subjectivities and have some kind of ideology to answer the question. It can't be hidden away completely, but the minute we start dealing with facts and analysis and move away from the social media space, in my view, we can gain back some of the credibility that has been lost.
So as we talk about this, so we are talking about credibility in media or credibility in journalism. And I know the subject of our discussion is journalism, but can we lump the media, all various types of media, into that? Is there consensus? Because there has been an argument that some of the new media cannot be regarded as journalist practitioners.
No, it can't. I mean, you can't lump all media as journalism, and that's the kind of crisis. There is a crisis of credibility.
Okay.
And, you know, social media is not journalism. Blogging is not journalism. Opinion making on radio stations and talk show hosts, that's not journalism. And we've got to separate these things out.
Right.
And what's happened at the moment is just, there's just been this complete conflation due to digital disruption, a complete conflation of all kinds of media, including the fact that, you know, PR people are now more than journalists. They're higher numbers of PR people, and they are calling themselves journalists. So there's a serious crisis going on.
Chris, you don't regard yourself as a journalist, do you? Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so your international local experience, do you think, having been in South Africa, experienced the manner in which the media operates, that there is a crisis, there's a trust deficit?
Well, I think both is true. We live in the best times of journalism with the biggest audiences and the best opportunities in publishing things, in adding documents to, for our readers, in going multimedia live. And simultaneously, we have a deep crisis. There is no questioning about that. And this is something which does not only apply to South Africa. This is something that applies on a global stage. I worked as a correspondent in the United States, where we have this fight about media credibility day by day, driven by the man in the White House. We have it in the same way in Germany. So yes, I think we have a deep crisis, and the circumstances for journalism change dramatically, and we all have to fight to restore that.
In South Africa, what have been your observations, and is it in line with not only a developing country, but one where it is in its transition?
Yes, but Glenda mentioned already Gupta leaks. I mean, that's a sensation from a journalistic standpoint. So this is the best hour of journalism, the best product that journalism can provide. So I think it's not that I would judge in general and say like journalism is in decline or something like that. But we have to make the case for good journalism. We have to distinguish ourselves from what is online out there, as Glenda said, the blogging and that kind of stuff, opinion, and just noise out there. Journalism is something different. Journalism is to fact check, to go to different parties, ask for different opinions, to take your time in presenting the material. So there's a reason why there is journalism and not just direct publication that everybody can do.
Okay. So Nico, let's come to you. Just how do we measure credibility? There are obviously codes and ethics, codes of conduct and ethics. So looking from various media bodies, we'll look at SANEF. So you're sitting on a panel that's looking at media ethics at the moment. So is there anything, a litmus test that says this is how we judge whether or not we're in crisis, just generally speaking at first, and then we'll talk about the kind of matters that are before you?
Thank you so much.
No, I think let's just, there we go.
Old hand, well practiced. I know how to switch it on. Thank you so much, Tsepiso. About the issue of credibility is there a credibility crisis? I think my first point that I'd like to make is that it is important that we're having this conversation. It's so important that journalism and the media are coming under scrutiny over issues of credibility and ethical behavior, because we're not above reproach, and it's so important, particularly looking at the legislation and the Constitution, what it says about the role of the media, given the high freedom that we enjoy and the independence that we should have as journalists. Therefore, we should be under greater scrutiny in order to tell the news truthfully, accurately, and fairly. When we fall short when it comes to credibility, then there is a crisis. So we've seen that there have been examples of that happening. Otherwise, SANEF perhaps would not have felt the need to establish such a panel of inquiry. It's an independent panel that's going to examine whether there have been any ethical flouting by any media organizations in South Africa, what were the occasions or issues which led to that, and we're inviting people from across the spectrum in South Africa to submit their thoughts and their views and to give us oral or written submissions in order so we can adequately answer the question that you put to us, backed by research, backed by information. On that point, I'd just like to add on the issue of trust and credibility. The most recent research seems to suggest that, in fact, contrary to what we see online, there seems to be a great deal of trust in the South African news. And this is research which was done by the Reuters Institute of Journalism, which shows that about 49% of South Africans have trust in the news. Yet at the same time, 70% of those people who were surveyed cannot distinguish between fact and fiction of the news which they counter online. So we need to find out what's happening between those two.
So this is the thing. It comes down to whether or not, when we talk about credibility, is it trust in journalism, the news media, or trust in journalists, the individuals? So where do you think, just based on what you're saying, because judging from also social media, the interpersonal conversation, there seems to imply a greater trust than in general news media.
I think we need to make that distinction clear, that journalists are practicing their craft in the traditional media space, yet they're also practicing it in social media. So we have to be alive to that. I don't think it's accurate to dismiss social media platforms and say they are not journalism, because journalists are practicing that craft in these new tools. We have to engage with these new tools. We have to apply similarly the same rules, the same veracity, the same standards around ethics, around truthfulness, around reliability, around fairness, whether it's on new media or the traditional media.
So judging from the cases that are before you, finally, is there a crisis of credibility in general in South Africa in news media?
Well, the inquiry which has been established by SANEF about a month ago is an independent panel, as you know. So it's going to look at possible ethical breaches within the media. We began our work last month. I'm not in a position to preempt any of those findings, but I do want to say that we have been encouraged by the number of submissions. We're inviting people. This is a voluntary process. So we're getting submissions from people in the media, journalists themselves, media owners, political organizations, religious institutions. And we'd like to encourage more and more people to come forward, because that is the whole point of this. We want to have a thorough analysis and investigation. So we can come up with recommendations which can, if indeed there is a credibility crisis, if indeed there have been ethical breaches, we can prevent that in the future.
So actually then the question comes how journalists themselves respond to criticism. Do they respond positively when it's from non-news professionals? Are they open to that criticism? I'm obviously asking you pointedly because of your own personal experience. So share with us, what are your thoughts?
So for myself personally, I am open to criticism, but to answer your larger question, I don't think it's a question of whether journalists and media in South Africa are willing to be open. They don't have a choice, right? We have mechanisms in place in the form of the Press Ombudsman, in the form of the BCCSA, that are binding on most of us. The Press Ombudsman is a voluntary thing, so you do have certain publications like the Independent Group that chooses not to be a part of that. But most mainstream publications do choose to be part of it. So the difference is, and it's a difference and a concern that I really have, is that the democratizing of that power through social media is very strong and very powerful. It's great. But then what happens is that it short circuits established mechanisms that are there for a reason and that are able to properly adjudicate matters that need to be adjudicated fairly with due process. When a social media mob rises up against someone who's made a mistake, which is what I experienced, the problem is that you will experience either disproportionate or unfair or some other kind of censure that isn't in keeping with other people who have made the same mistakes. Whereas with the Press Ombudsman, the BCCSA, they are bound, the same way a court is bound, by their previous judgments. They have to treat everyone fairly. Social media doesn't, we can...
I think then you are judged as an individual, as you say, obviously in your own individual space, you made an apology, others accuse you of being strident in making that apology. You're saying that it's disproportionate and there's lack of equality in how we judge the news media in general. And the standards to which we judge them by when we say this is either factual error or an error, either in good faith, misinformation, disinformation, we've spoken about that, and the role of when we talk about credibility in the media?
So what's the question?
So I'm asking you, do you think it's about you, your own individual response to that criticism? Again, as I said, some said you were strident in how you accepted that fault.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks for the clarity. I'm not talking particularly about myself, but for those who are not familiar with my example, a fake blog was published on Huffington Post. I took responsibility. There was an enormous sort of campaign that I resigned, and I resigned. So I was editor at the time. What I'm more talking about is the fact that there is no justice in mob justice. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So I would say this of people I disagree with, or, you know, journalists whose views I don't agree with, who I think printed a wrong story. When I see people going after them, you know, I've literally called up someone like Barry Bateman when he was being attacked for making a very unwise tweet about the woke, I don't know, something about woke people. You know, it's a very sort of, I thought it was a very, you know, in poor taste tweet, but I thought the way people went after Barry was completely unfair. If he had done something wrong, there should be due process so that he is held to the same standard as everyone else. And that is my objection to, I love the fact that social media exists and that it can put pressure on organizations that have typically hidden behind the sort of opaque structures, and you got lost in their processes trying to appeal whatever they had done. I love that it puts pressure on people, but I don't like the fact that there is no consistency to their anger.
Okay. So, Chris, there's a reason I was asking this, because there are those who say journalism or journalists is not open to criticism if people are unfamiliar with the news process. But then others will say, can you have a clear set of rules for people whom you expect to use their hearts, their minds, their consciousness in making certain determinations, whether it's about the directions which stories take or just even the greater nuance of the ideology that they're trying to push, whether it's developmental or not?
I do media training with clients, and my training is, no matter what they ask you in the interview, say what you want to say.
So you're about to do that.
I'm going to do that.
Thanks for the warning.
I often have conversations with journalists about why they don't do research into why people hate them so much. Because I think what they would find is people think journalists think they're special. They think they have a right to dig in people's dustbins and go through their bank accounts, but they don't like it when the same thing happens to them. They like to form Twitter mobs and pursue people, but they don't like it when the Twitter mobs turn on them. And I think that's a lesson I learned in 2010 when I started writing about Confessions of a Spin Doctor, of how easy it is to get a press release into a South African newspaper or on radio, how easy it is to write articles and have a reporter stick their name on top of it. The response was not introspection from South African journalists. It was, how dare you suggest that there's something wrong with what we do. So that's my first point. I might answer your question. The second point is I also think that journalists, we can't pretend that journalism is performed in a bubble. And that it's not performed by human beings. Journalists are human beings most of the time, right? So they drink, they have sex, they smoke weed, they get angry, they have political views. So their lived experience colors how they approach the society they report on. But in return, they are influenced by the society that we live in. So if you ask me why there's a particular ethical collapse in some South African media sectors at the moment, I would say it's indicative of the society that we're living in, where the Gauteng government can kill 200 people by moving them from Life Isidimeni to spaza shop welfare shop, where Tiger Brands can kill you by making polony that is poisoned, where the auditing profession can do the most outrageous things, where consultancy firms like McKinsey can do the most outrageous things. That ethical collapse is a very real element of South African society. Just look at Jacob Zuma, right? The icon of an ethical collapse. So I'm saying, as South Africans, we're all affected by that. Now, some journalists have the backbone or the courage to stand firm against corruption or offers of free trips to Zanzibar. and others don't. And it's a very personal decision, in my view, whether you are ethical and honest and you have integrity or you are not. And I think that if we have those kind of conversations and don't think of journalism as this kind of rarefied thing, which is immune from criticism and not affected by the society that it lives in, we probably reach a more realistic conclusion about what you do about it.
How would we then define audience perception of journalism or journalists in general?
Well,
because
I think it speaks to
is
what
it just
Glenda-
about the bottom line?
No, it's what Glenda was saying earlier. I don't think you can say journalism is good or bad. There are some Bugatti journalists out there. New Frame, we were talking about earlier, is an excellent example. The Daily Maverick, some of the Amabungani stuff. But there's rubbish as well, right? And I think what we need to look at is understand why the rubbish exists. And it is often because of the bottom line. There's a market for the Daily Sun. There's a market for the kind of stuff that gets produced. We need to make sure, you need to make sure that you're producing better stuff, that it has integrity, and that it is able to stand the test of, is it true, is it fair, is it ethical, and has it taken into account the damage that it could cause? Because I think sometimes journalists forget about that too. Ask the SARS rogue unit people about the damage that's been caused to their lives, financial, moral, in terms of getting jobs again. You know, that all those things need to be borne in mind in trying to answer the sort of questions that you're raising now, and I hope I have answered at least some of your questions.
I think you have. So I'm going to throw a few questions to my panelists while I ask for maybe 5 questions from the floor, and you can pose questions from what we've already spoken about, or perhaps you can share what your perception is of journalism and credibility. So just given the conversation we've just had, and any of you can answer this question, as a microcosm of society, who then do we say qualifies to be a journalist? And you spoke about lived experiences that would reflect relevance for the current society that we live in. Who then decides, who judges those people who are appointed to those positions? And we can also talk about media ownership. You spoke about that bottom line. How much is at the source of where we are now if we're raising issues of credibility? Okay, so any takers, go ahead. Nikyo?
I'd like to respond to some of the points which were raised by Chris Vick. Yes, of course, journalists are a microcosm of society. They're informed by the lived realities of being in South Africa. But I think it's always important to remind them that they're grounded and their work is guided by the code which they ascribe to, those institutions which do indeed subscribe to the press code. And the values and principles underlined in the press code are quite simple and true, as you said. Was the news true? Was it accurate? Was it fair? So it's not us holding them to a higher standard, it's the standard which they hold themselves to. And that is why we judge them when they fall short of that. And I think it's important for the journalism sector and the media sector to have that discussion and to introspect. We can't just say that, well, the country is in trouble, therefore, you know, everyone will be affected. It's also because there are certain protections granted by the Constitution which give us higher freedom than other people for our protected speech, that we should be above reproach. We should hold a higher standard when it comes to truth. That is why, in fact, we are having this discussion, because journalists should be held to a particular standard in terms of safeguarding what is the truth.
Seem like you want to jump in there?
Let's remind what the role of journalism in a democracy is. And I think the core of our role is that we have to hold the powerful accountable. We're not out there to produce nice stories about ourselves, to make ourselves, put ourselves into the center. We are out there to hold the powerful accountable, be it in politics, be it in the economy sector, be it in society elsewhere. And I think that is the core, and that should make us a little bit more humble. We can't be part of the elite. For many years, I would say for decades, journalists felt great if they would be part of the elite of a society. So I think we contributed in many ways to that crisis of credibility. We were way too arrogant. We tried to be part of the big game. And I think there are some reasons out there. So we have to change our behavior in many ways.
So hold on, I've got to ask this thing. So not necessarily about fact checking, but if a news media or journalist takes a particular side or takes on a particular ideology. That's not necessarily incorrect, is it? So should we be encouraging the media to be more transparent with the so-called agenda that they're pushing? And how much does funding, you're from Germany, donor funding has been found to account for something like $100 billion from America to Africa alone annually. So there must certainly be an end goal in influencing a narrative that comes out.
Well, I think if you want to write an opinion piece, fair enough, but say it. Say, this is my opinion. This is a very personal account. If you're pursuing a story where you try to collect facts, make clear that this is not about ideology. This is about the story. Distinguish opinion from reporting about facts, and tell your readers what you're doing. So we've invented a small thing, it's called a transparency box, where we say, how do we start that research? Why did we start it? What did we do? To whom did we talk to? So people can judge for themselves the path that we pursued during a research. So I think being as transparent as possible is crucial, is elementary in those days where almost everybody is able to scrutinize what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to funding, of course, yes, we have to say who's the owner behind a newspaper or TV outlet. We have to say where the money comes from. Money is crucial in a society. We all know that. And if there are some dark fundings, that makes me suspicious.
So, Glenda, let's get to the crux of the matter. We are where we are as a country at the moment in the kind of debate we're having now because of perceived agendas by contributors to news organizations, whether it be journalists. And William spoke about an app that they have earlier on to encourage transparency. Having journalists, columnists, contributors declare their personal interests, is it something that's going to create a transparency that's going to engender greater trust in our credibility?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it is happening already. Because you'd see with the conversation, it's academic come journalism. And you have to disclose where you get your funding from and what kind of disclosure, where your funding comes from, and do you have an interest in the story? With Amabungani, they do it already. It's the new trend at the moment. In fact, it seems like trusted media are the ones that are disclosing where their funds are coming from, how they're using it. And indeed, in the olden days, when I was a journalist, we would have sections that were news sections, analysis sections, opinion sections. And because all that's dropped by the wayside, that's part of the reason for the crisis that we find ourselves, including the fact that we have digital disruption and social media entering the space, or us entering the social media space. But unless we do this transparency thing, and unless we flag what the story is about, who we are, the fact that not so long ago, about 5 years ago, journalists and editors were told that they must enter the business side of things. I mean, my hair stood on end because I realized this is the beginning of the end. When journalists enter the business side of things and you couch things as editorial when they're actually advertorial, you're finished.
Right, so we're going to come back to Varashni and Chris, because I also want to ask you this question as a spin doctor. Obviously, I come to you for a service, and that is information that is disseminated within the media. How do we then read the information that we're getting from particular journalists as a result of that targeted messaging? But we're going to take a quick break. Don't go away. Watching SABC News Channel 404, coming to you live here from the Goethe Institute, where we're talking about the future of journalism, looking at credibility in the media. We'll be back in just a moment.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. and listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial.
My experience in the industry has been both a roller coaster and pure bliss, if I may put it that way. I started off as an intern. I was an all-rounder. I used to do everything. And I think that was the back-breaking phase of my life, but I'm grateful for it, and I think it prepared me for my current roles. And it was also by the help of the women who welcomed me into the industry.
For questions, I just didn't see any hands shoot up immediately. So, okay, there I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's do this. I've got 2 here, 2 there, 3.
And then I also just want to say that I'm worried that this discussion is becoming a little bit elite. We can sit here and say there's journalism and there's everything else. The audience doesn't see it that way. And if they don't see it that way, what are we doing besides sitting in ivory towers telling them how to talk and think when they're not? People think Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh is a journalist. Just because you think he's got a personality and he's not trained in journalism and he's on a talk show, that doesn't matter to the thousands of people who follow him, right? People think many of the Daily Maverick opinionistas are journalists. Just because you don't think they're a journalist doesn't mean that they're not seen as that. So I think a better way to combat kind of declining standards of journalism is to welcome all of these people into the fold, to go to the broadcasters and the columnists and the people setting up their blog that's suddenly blown up and saying to them, hey, come get some training, come learn about the basics of journalism, come be a member of SANEF and the press code and subscribe to the BCSA. Let's open the gates instead of trying to close it and keep people out.
Okay, so let's take questions from the floor. There's a microphone nearby. Okay, there's a roving mic. Let's just first start with this row here. I've got 2 questions here, and we've got another 2 there and another 2 there. Please introduce yourself, and if you'd like to direct your question to anybody in particular, please do so, but please keep it brief.
Oh, okay. Okay, my name is Sipati. Thank you, Tsepiso, for inviting us. And then, you know what? I'm so happy you mentioned the funding problem. We are the victims. And for us, our journalists or reporters or our media, I was reading here when it says promoting human rights and democracy through media. For us, our media doesn't work for us. We are the victims. We know that, you know what, if they're covering some stories, some they are not covering. It seems like they are checking which companies or maybe who are we complaining about. So if they see, oh, it's Tsepiso and Tsepiso is famous, they don't cover our story. For example, last year in September, on the 2nd of September, our story was on special assignment. You know, the sensitive part was not aired. You know, I even phoned and sent email, thought that maybe there will be a follow-up story, only to find that it was not like that. And even funding Tsepiso, that is the problem. We are now fighting, we are requesting the political parties to disclose who's funding them. Okay. But we are not asking the media companies who's funding them. Today our stories are not aired or captured or covered because the same companies that are destroying our life, that are destroying the poor of the life of the poor, they are protected. So our media is Tsepiso, our story is so sad, our local media, hence I'm asking, maybe the guy from Germany will take our story. Okay, but locally, our media company failed us.
Okay, Sipati, can you please hand over? Okay, that's because just for convenience. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Thabo Tsulo. It's my mom.
Oh, okay. You should have told us. Should have declared. Okay.
So I'm talking about
Very
the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on to what Mr. Stark said about the media, or the journalist's obligation is to hold the powerful accountable. Right now we're fighting one of the biggest lawsuits post-apartheid. It's a lawsuit against ABI and SAB Miller, suing the company for 6.3 billion against a lot of things, but a lot of people here, if we were to see in a show of hands, how many people know about the story? None. Because you mentioned a lot of things like media credibility, fairness, and all of that stuff, but what happens to the stories that are blatantly ignored, like our stories? Because we attended major events, every broadcast event we've been to, and we've showed our faces, and no one records or takes note of it. Only one media company did that, was the Daily Maverick, and they've gone to win a lot of awards via our story. That's to show the credibility of our story. We're not lying, but what we're asking for is justice and compensation. Thank you.
So if we could please just take the gentleman in the glasses there at the back, if we can. So Varasha, you had a question. I noted according to who took their hands up first, so let's rather stick with that, and then we will give more people an opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When we talk of the future of journalism, we also this also integrates a lot with journalism of the future. Now, journalism addresses many aspects of the huge challenges that are facing humanity. So my question is, how can journalism really help to sketch an alternative picture of what can an inspiring vision look like that actually solves and addresses many of the challenges we have around us at the moment?
All right. There was the gentleman in front of you, please. Actually, okay. Oh, hi, Kida, but it's fine. You'll please pass it on.
I'm sorry. My name is Manda. I'm from Hulikane movement. They've touched on journalists and media. I think also government, our government must be included there because we have been all over, but even the government sectors, they don't listen to our story. We'll end up not knowing where to go now. That's it.
All right, thank you to the gentleman in front with the glasses as well, and then I've got two more questions.
My name is Dimitri Martinez. Question about former journalists that are now becoming spokespersons for either state institutions or corporates. Is there something, how does one explain that? There seems to be quite a wave. Is it maybe that's how it's so easy to get articles in? People saying, okay, well, I know the media, so I'll do it for you. And then if I may ask a second question about the public broadcaster, are they held, should they be held to a different standard? Or is a journalist, whether they work for the public broadcaster or for a commercial or community media? Thank you.
If you could please pass on, yes, and then after that, Dr. Stremla.
Hello, my name is Kinelo Nkodi. I would like to ask a question based on accessibility and on access to credible media in the country, because we speak a lot about there being social media today has been the most accessible platform for a large amount of South African society, which is why the engagements on that platform become so rapid so quickly. And so I think the question here is to say that the most credible, how do we give access to the lower denominators in this country to credible information? Because what's easily available, I would say, is information that's not credible, and which is why we're in this position right now.
Okay, just behind you, Dr. Stremla, and then we'll take more questions.
Yeah.
I'll get replies, and then we'll come back for more questions.
There have been an awful lot of questions. John Stremla here. I just had a question for the panel about the rarefied atmosphere at academic institutions, because universities are increasingly getting engaged socially, and I think as public institutions they should. We have this experiment of the conversation, which is staffed by journalists, but only publishes academics who are willing to engage on issues that are thought important. Do you think that has any promise, that cross-sectoral cooperation?
All right, thank you. And perhaps if we could just start with you, Glenda, an interesting point that John Stremla is asking there. The issue of intellectual exclusion has been mentioned a number of times in the criticism against the media, and thus issues of credibility. What are your thoughts about that? And also, media theory, has that evolved when we look at what credibility is?
Well, I think we need to look at what the audiences want, and more research needs to be done. So to answer a whole lot of different questions with one answer, it's that journalists are actually doing the same old voices, same old things, ANC, EFF. And that's why people are getting so tired. So this kind of story, that important story that you've got is missed, besides with the Daily Maverick. The kind of thing that the conversation is doing is actually fantastic, because it's research on the ground, the research dealt with by academics and then made accessible by journalists. I think that's a fantastic model. Then we've got New Frame, which is doing wonderful stories and ground up as well. So there are little, what I call decolonial green shoots that are coming up to challenge mainstream media. Mainstream media is actually dying, if not dead already. That model is over, that advertising model is over. We need to be looking at not-for-profits, non-profits, philanthropic models, and encourage people to support those, because those are the ones that are actually doing the interesting stuff at the moment. So About the public broadcaster, yes, absolutely, the public broadcaster must be held to the same standards as all other journalism, otherwise it's a state broadcaster.
Is it an issue of funding? Because that has come very starkly to the fore given the challenges faced now.
You mean about the SABC and the inquiry?
Yes.
I mean, the inquiry was...
Not the inquiry per se, but just in terms of its mandate and
the mandate
what standards you hold them up to.
The mandate is to inform the people and to be a conduit of information for everyone, never, never, never to any political party. And the minute it's captured by any faction, whether it's a Zuma faction or a Cyril faction or any faction, then it's lost its mandate. Because it's clear that mandate that it's got and that code of ethics that the SABC got is a wonderful one. It's just not adhered to because it's being pulled from like a tug of war from one side to another by political forces, unfortunately.
Well, what is the German experience in terms of public broadcasting? You know, again, I'll say people have spoken about how there is a collapse of what we've seen as traditional media models, and that's why you see an advent of more and more different media outfits. How does that influence a public broadcaster, for instance? What has been your experience in that? And you may also answer some of the other questions that have been raised.
Well, we have a model in Germany which is quite unique given our historical past. Maybe you can compare it with the BBC. So we have a model where we have public broadcasting companies, two major ones, that are being funded by the taxpayers, basically. So the state is collecting the taxes and then funding those broadcast companies. Those are the backbones of the public debate, and there's a lot of debate how biased they are and if they are biased at all. So they are under scrutiny all the time. I still think this is a valuable part of the public sphere, and it's really important. So I would always defend that model because it supports quality journalism. But I also would like to pick up the point that you made and say that as much as we have like the national journalism, the national political journalism, it's incredibly important to have the journalism of the people as well and to follow the smaller stories, the stories in rural parts, and not only to engage into a national debate and into a national conversation. And we have all the space online to do that. The old days where we were limited are over. So we have to find ways how to engage with the readers more and make that possible. I think that's crucial that people see us as part of their life.
All right. So, Nikki, strong democracy supports strong media. The question was asked about the future of media. So how does the media meet its purpose in line with the new challenges and with the new platforms that are emerging?
I think it's very important to strengthen the fundamentals of what journalism ought to be and what it ought to strive for. I'm often fond of reporting a sentiment from the American journalist Dan Rather, who once said that he doesn't care if the news is delivered by a pigeon or by a message in a bottle or a mobile phone. The fundamental question is, was it true? So whatever the platform is, however sophisticated or advanced it is technologically, we as journalists still have to go back to the basics, and I don't think we do that enough. But I'd like to respond to some of the questions from the audience, if you'll allow. Tsepiso? Sipati, I apologize. The question around funding and resources, it's a critical question. And we know that there is a bias in our journalism towards reporting in urban areas. So media houses need to be able to allocate resources to the underserved parts of our country, right? Because the media's fundamental role, as outlined in the press code, is to serve society. And society is found across rural and urban. So if there are stories around exploitation of poorer parts of the country, the media should be playing a leading role in doing just that. So I agree with you that not enough resources are allocated. But as has been said here, the business model for journalism is broken. It doesn't work. So there isn't money to do that. So we need to look at innovative ways of funding the kind of journalism that serves our society. On to the issue around not enough attention on the SAB Miller story, which was mentioned also. in seeking to hold power to account, it's not just government we hold to account. It's business that ought to be held to account, or anyone else in positions of authority. And often I think we don't do that enough. That's been one of the major criticisms about South African journalism, that we tend to have disproportionate attention towards the public sector and not enough to the private sector, which is why there was such an uproar around the reporting on Steinhoff, that we seem to have been caught by surprise. Meanwhile, there was this massive fraud taking place in South Africa. So certainly stories like that need to be highlighted, and indeed it's part of our duty to reflect a multiplicity of voices, a plurality of voices all of the time. We don't always do it, but it is our duty. It's actually outlined in the code as well. So we need to be reminded of that. I want to respond to the question around the prevalence of journalists moving into the roles of spokespeople. It is very interesting. Glenda, I think you might be able to add on to this as well, because some of the research that you've done has shown how the staff complement within Newsroom has been decimated over the past 10 years. Whereas 10 years ago, we might have had 10,000 journalists in a newsroom. We now have about 5,000. And that's partly because of this broken business model. There aren't enough resources to fund good quality journalism and to pay that staff. And most of those senior people typically are now moving into corporate communications or public relations, because those are their skills. That's where they can ply their trade. And naturally, they have access to the journalists in those newsrooms. So those are their connections. And that's how they make it work. So that's why that's happening. So in terms of access to credible media, social media certainly cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored. It's where young people are communicating, well, people across the board, really. But I do think in the concerns which have arisen of late around disinformation campaigns, the use of bots posing as people, where these are nameless, faceless people who are perpetuating certain agendas with nefarious ends, we need to be mindful and vigilant against what's happening in the online spaces in order to protect our democracy.
So Virashni, you can also answer some of the questions, but I want to highlight what Nigo's just said, the decimation of staffing in the news media. You were complaining earlier on that perhaps we're a bit elitist in this conversation, but then diversity is affected then, isn't it, when there are job losses in the newsroom? So isn't it just also a mirror of what is happening in society, that lack of plurality?
I think perhaps the lack of plurality and diversity is a separate question from the decimation of newsrooms, but take the question together. I absolutely agree that there's been a decimation in newsrooms. I inherited the Mail and Guardian newsroom as editor when it was incredible, having seen it expand dramatically under the editor before, Nick Dawes, or previous editor, and seeing the amount of resources we had, and managing editor and this editor and that editor, and suddenly I was left with this sort of decimated newsroom. And I see under Khadija it's really been built up again, but I've heard rumors of another retrenchment, which is very sad, and this is just the reality of the broken model my colleagues have spoken about. But there's been a rise of funded journalism. Now that rise is not without controversy, but it has enabled amazing journalism. So if I have to just list a number of those kind of publications, Glenda already did. There's also Becky Sisa, there's Amabungani, there's Ground Up, there's New Frame, there's Africa Check, there's The Conversation. All of those funded journalism. And they're doing important journalism and work that wouldn't otherwise generate ads that would pay for it, that wouldn't generate membership. Those are the typical ways you pay for journalism: subscribers, or advertising, or events, or donor funding. And those publications I just listed, which are all doing very important work, and I must just add that The Conversation is just one part of it, and yes, you could say it's very academic, but as Glenda pointed out, it serves a role. But coming back to the mother and son duo here, I'd like to ask you guys, what area are you guys from? Joburg South. Now that's bizarre to me that your story did not get attention, given that you are in a large metro. So how much worse for someone in the Eastern Cape, in the former Transkei, right? So the tragedy of the SABC is that they were the ones who were supposed to escape this curse of money and funding, because a commercial publication cannot have a bureau in every, I want to say city, but really it's every province at this point. Not even in sometimes people are shutting down their bureaus in Cape Town. I think Media 24 shut down its parliamentary bureau at one point. So what we really need is for the SABC to be strengthened again so that it can go to those areas and report the stories that are not commercially viable, right? That was what the SABC was for. But what's probably going to happen is that some kind of funded unit's going to spring up that will start taking care of those kind of stories, like the ground-ups and the new frames. And that's a failure of our state broadcaster. And then just one more thing, if you'll allow me.
Just a quick one, please, because we are running out of time.
Sure, sure. I'd like to talk to, I think it was Kanelwe, who spoke about how new media has opened up access. And I want to make a very important point. Before this advent of the disruption, as we keep talking about it, this space of journalism was incredibly untransformed, okay? Before Twitter really became a thing, I remember being in a newsroom and being like, oh my God, the only black person here is the person emptying my bin. Okay? Like the people in the newsrooms, the people who are making decisions, the people who owned it, were all a certain color and gender. We cannot deny that.
Okay, Varashni, I'm going to have to stop you. Chris, just so that you can have your final word, because we did say it is an hour's broadcast, so unfortunately that clock is ticking. So Chris, your final word on some of the issues raised, and perhaps also just to jump in on the issue of access.
Are we going to come back and say some more, or is this it?
I think we're going to give you 30 seconds each to...
At the end of the discussion? Well, let me put it in now in case I don't get my 30 seconds.
This is what I'm trying to get you to do.
Thank you. We've wasted 30 seconds. But I think there's another term that I think we need to introduce to the conversation, which is the impunity with which people have got away with bad practice in journalism. There are journalists who were active campaigners for Zuma who are now political analysts. No disclosure. There are people who were involved in very devious work when they were radio journalists who now run programs on crime. There are people who've been fired from the Sunday Times for doing backdoor deals with travel agents, who get re-employed, mess up again, and leave the building quietly. I think if the corporate sector or government had the impunity that some media houses have, they would be torn to shreds, right? This revolving door, the soft landing, the golden handshake, that means there's no accountability. I can write stories, I can publish stories that damage people's lives forever, and I get shown out the back door. I get made special projects editor or something like that. I really believe that impunity has to be dealt with.
So how should journalists who've done wrong be treated by the mechanisms that are already in place? Some complain are not adequate.
Well, I'll give you an example. In South Africa, you can write the most horrific stuff. You can be taken to the press council and you can get an apology. And that's it. There's no fine. On radio, you can say a word like DJ Freshted that starts with an M, and you can get hit with a 50,000 Rand fine, right? I think that the print media industry needs to think about fines for people who commit transgressions and reparations. I think it's time to start talking about how you repair the damage that you've caused to people's lives with unethical, dishonest journalism. And that money gets paid to the victims, to the people who have been wronged by the media industry. It happens in the accounting profession, happens with auditors.
And the press ombudsman, is it sufficient to be able to be an arbiter for some of those things? Because some of the complaints have been, it's so mechanical that if you printed a story on this page, you will do it on the same page on so much, but the real damage has already been done, and even the wording is not enough.
Well, I think it's 10 times better than it was, and it gets better every day with richer judgments. But I think if the media profession, let's talk about the profession, not the industry, if it's to deal with the lack of credibility, the fact that its social license is virtually kaput, there needs to be a quantum leap, and I'm hoping that Nikiwe's panel is going to recommend that, a quantum leap in how ethical issues are dealt with, a code of, an integrity pledge that journalists sign on the 19th of October and have their pictures taken and stick it on the wall, fines for journalists who continue to mess up, real action that gets taken, conversations about reparations, in the same way that it's happening with KPMG and SAP and McKinsey, etc. They did wrong things. They're being held accountable. People got fired, boards changed, lifestyle audits were introduced. Find me a newspaper or a media house where there's a lifestyle audit. Because those things will tell you who's getting brown envelopes with documents and who's getting brown envelopes with money in them.
I would actually like to take questions, but I'm hoping I'm going to get an indication of the amount of time remaining. I'm sort of working in the dark here. So, Nikio, let's get a response from you, and then I'll... Okay, yes, go ahead.
And I really welcome Chris's suggestions here, and we welcome all manner of submissions to this particular email address, panel@mediainquiry.co.za. We want to hear from ordinary South Africans about how they think the media, if indeed journalists have erred, how they should be held to greater account. That's what we're exploring. So this is not an empty exercise, Chris. You know we mean well, and we're assisting SANEF in this manner. So we're welcoming submissions, we're inviting people. We don't have powers of subpoena. This is a voluntary process, but those people we have invited have indeed complied and come forward. So these kinds of submissions or suggestions that are coming from Chris are useful, and they're worth exploring, and these are the kinds of things that we want to think about, because indeed, as Chris says, harm has been caused, and it is explicit in the codes that we may not cause unnecessary harm. So where there has been harm, there should be, of course, repercussions, and people should be held to account. And how do we strengthen those ethical guidelines within our sector?
Holder, you did mention it earlier on, the combined role of freedom of expression, but also the responsibility that comes with it, the media. And there has been criticism by some against the media that they do believe that they're beyond reproach. So what is your sense, and perhaps you can share best practices with us, where you've been in Germany, incidents, you can perhaps share incidents, and how to, mediate that conversation, but also find remedial action that will please those who have been injured.
But allow me to push back first of all against Chris' idea, because I think this is an idea which fires back at the end. I understand the mechanism if there is some real harm, that there needs to be some consequences, and I agree in the broader terms. But if you open the Pandora's box to fine journalists, to try to compensate for their work, this is something what the Guptas of this world will use to basically block critical journalism and to bring journalists into a legal conversation that basically ends up with not reporting anymore but defending them in court. So I think this is a very critical tool. I understand the idea, but I think there are better mechanisms of holding journalists accountable, and this is through the public dialogue and they're attacking their reputation and bringing up facts where they were lying and so on. So I'm not sure if we need legal measures on that. I want to share with you one case from Germany which really was disrupting Germany's media sector last year. There was a reporter from a very well-known public magazine called Der Spiegel, my former employer, so it's probably the best known German magazine at all. And this reporter pretended to do reporting for over a course of 5 years. So he pretended to write a story about climate change from a small island called Kiribati. In fact, he was based in Los Angeles in a hotel and never was on that island. He pretended to be on the road at the Mexican border with some Trump militias. Basically, he was writing the story from Phoenix, from the hotel pool. And this really has shaken the industry, and there was at the line the credibility of the media sector in general, and there was a public commission quite similar to what you're doing, which investigated the case, and we all learned our lessons. We all invented in the newsrooms rules of ethical conduct, what the reporters are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to go. So I think I completely agree that we need to refine our standards, we need to make them public, and we need to engage with the readers about our standards and make our work as transparent as possible.
So I have had an indication that I've got 4 minutes, so I'm going to take just 3 questions, and I'm sorry I can't come back to the same people. Very, very briefly, please be brief. I'm going to, do I have a microphone over there? Ask the lady there who's got her hand up in the 5th row. Okay, while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to be, there's a young lady there in the middle, in the black and white t-shirt, and let's go there at the back, spreading the love. Please Okay, you're pointing at somebody, but you're not saying who. Okay, if they're not volunteering, I'm afraid I can't. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I've heard a few people mention accessibility, and then somebody else mentioned exclusionary tactics. What's interesting is nobody's mentioned the importance of language. We're talking about a country where probably a good less than 70% of the people actually speak English, yet I have yet to find print media, even journalists who are printing in a language other than English. And so that right there speaks to exclusion. That right there speaks to accessibility. There aren't enough.
Okay.
And definitely from maybe the visual medias, and so TV, SABC has the few stations that will have a language for 30 minutes or news in a language for 30 minutes, and then you'll get the radio stations that will have content completely in one language. But what you want is diversity for the audience member to be able to pick from several different news sources and in their own languages, and I think people are missing that.
All right, so there's a lady here, and Des, I'm looking at you. Yes, stand up. There's the mic coming your way. You can't believe I picked you. Yes, I did. I've been trying to pick you. Okay.
Hi everyone, sorry I might be a bit shy, which is why I'm reading from my phone, but I just wanted to touch on journalistic criticism and how it's handled, and I wanted to speak more to like the gendered lens to journalistic criticism. And this obviously speaks to some of the issues that our panel has touched on, and the different barriers that journalists also have to face, such as language, class, gender, and ethnical barriers. But I want to point at the lengths at which the public attack female journalists. And it's an issue that definitely needs to be highlighted. The types of attacks and linguistical violence that happens in the anonymous veil of social media. More needs to be done considering
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very good point to end our discussion on. So, Glenda, I'll ask you to please respond to that while you also give your final remarks. If I could give you all a minute each to please do that. I know it's...
Yeah, thanks, Paula, for asking that question or making that comment, because it's my biggest concern at the moment. I feel that journalism has become gendered. The bullying in journalism is directly at women who speak out, who are outspoken, and who are doing the stories. So they're not sexualizing men for doing the stories, because there are a lot of men investigative reporters. But the minute women are... You know, it's been investigations on SARS, it's been investigations on the VBS, all these things. And women have been sexualized online. They've had images put online, which, you know, it's not them. It's about white monopoly capital. It's about Bell Pottinger, and they've all been targeting women. So it's called cyber misogyny, of course. We have to find a way in which to catch the bullies and do something. It's mainly political parties, of course, and it's other journalists who have been found to be wanting in the SARS rogue unit stories over 6 years, and have now started up their own kind of bots and trolls, and also directed at women. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but there has to be some kind of censure of those people.
Okay.
Well, I only can say to my people, work as hard as you can, be as relentless as you can. Society needs great journalism, and I still think it's the best profession in the world. And beside that, I would say, be careful not to print Chris PR op-eds.
And the issue of language, if I could just get you... Okay. Perhaps, Nico, you can talk about that, the issue of language.
Absolutely, a very important point which was raised, which also along that fault line as well of race, class and language informs how credible a media we can be. And given the demographics of our country, where indeed, of course, even English is the language of business, English is the language of most medium, but it's not the language of the majority of South Africans. Mm-hmm. And if the resources did exist, indeed, it would be to encourage that there were more publications, more broadcast outlets that serve the majority of the South African public. But I do want to commend the SABC, which does an extraordinary job in that regard, particularly with radio and television. But I do also want to just say finally, to support what Glenda has been saying, the weaponization of social media against bullying of women journalists specifically. Farrell Haffiji writing quite poignantly just last week about the chilling effect this has had on independent political journalists who are striving to tell the truth but are consistently being bullied physically and online when they want to do their job. And my parting shot is that please write to us, panel@mediainquiry.co.za. And Toni Morrison, who passed away just recently, said that the role of the press, the most important role of the press or the media, is to help us make meaning of our lives and to help us understand what it means to be human in the 21st century. So that's what we need to do.
Sorry about that. Roshni, just your final word? Yes, we're running on time.
So just to quickly finish the point I was making, the reason there is so much mistrust in the media from large swaths of the population, young people like Kanilwe, is because it has historically been so untransformed and has presented views that have often been in keeping with only parts of society. So I think a lot of people have turned to social media out of extreme frustration with newsrooms that were not transformed. That's thankfully changing, in part because of the pressure from social media. But I think in a country like South Africa, we can't ignore those race and class dynamics. Germany is a far more homogenous society, I think. But in our country, those issues have really created a lot of mistrust in our mainstream media.
Right. And Chris, your final word?
I mean, I think we've realized tonight, if we didn't know it already, there's no single cause for the ethical problem. And in the same way, there's no silver bullet that's going to fix it. It's going to take a package. Hopefully it comes out of the panel and out of journalists doing something about it. Because ultimately, it's a very personal decision to take a bribe or run a press release or whatever. And the maxim I lived by during my brief time as a journalist is don't do anything to other people that you wouldn't want them to do to yourselves. And I think if journalists have that in their mind when they approach their craft or profession, we'll move quite a long way.
Thank you very much to all of you. Please give them a warm round of applause. Our panelists there, Glenda Daniels, Chris Vick, Holger Stark, and Vareshni Pillay, Nikiwe Bigicha. Thank you very much to all of you. And that's it from us here at the Goethe Institute. Stephen, it's back to you.